Hello, and welcome to the law lecture titled Louisiana Law Update and Other Interesting Topics. My name is Brian Primo, and I will be your lecturer for this lecture. I am a P4 student, and I am also currently a member of the APHA-ASP National Policy Standing Committee. Today's lecture will consist of 4 parts. The first part, the part you're currently watching, will be on the Louisiana Law Update. Part 2 will be on provider status. Part 3 will consist of antimicrobial resistance, and Part 4 will discuss care transitions. Now let's begin with Part 1, our Louisiana Law Update for 2013. During this lecture, we will discuss the following updates: Technician Training Program, Hospital Off-Site Satellite Pharmacies, Preferential Licensing for Military, Penal Pharmacy Permit, Out-of-State Penal Pharmacies, and the Collaborative Drug Therapy Management. The first update is concerning technician training programs. Chapter 9 of the Board Rules was revised in July of 2013, and they repealed the original Section 903B, which dealt with structured programs, and they added in Section 905A.3, Part B, where it states for those applicants submitting applications on or after January 1st, 2016, the applicant shall demonstrate successful completion of a nationally accredited and board-approved pharmacy technician training program, as evidenced by a valid and legible copy of the appropriate credential from that program. This is a change from the original wording of the board rules, which just talked about structured programs that were used for pharmacy technician candidates to be eligible for licensure. The next update is dealing with hospital off-site satellite pharmacies. Chapter 15 of the Board Rules was revised in May of 2013. During this time, they repealed the previous Section 1525, which talked about remote processing of medical orders, and issued a new Section 1525 entitled Hospital Off-Site Satellite Pharmacy. Part A of Section 1525 discusses the issuance and maintenance of the permit, and it discusses that this satellite pharmacy must come from a pharmacy that has the same hospital license number as the facility housing the provider pharmacy. The provider pharmacy, acting through its pharmacist in charge, shall make application for the satellite pharmacy permit using a form and process specified by the board. The applicant must pay the fee, and the permit expires on December 31st of each year unless suspended or revoked earlier by the board. The satellite pharmacy also shall renew its permit using the form specified by the board, and if the provider pharmacy closes permanently and surrenders its permit, the hospital off-site satellite pharmacy shall also close and surrender its permit. Part B of Section 1525 just discussed the general requirements of the satellite pharmacy, such as the pharmacy shall be of sufficient size and shall contain sufficient fixtures, equipment, and supplies with the scope of practice for that pharmacy. The PIC of that provider pharmacy shall also be responsible for that off-site satellite pharmacy. The provider pharmacy and off-site satellite must share a common electronic file. And also, compounding in the satellite must follow USP 797 for sterile preparations and USP 795 for non-sterile preparations. The next update discusses preferential licensing for military, and it's in Chapter 5, and it was revised recently in November of 2013. Chapter 5, a section was added to it, 506, which was titled Preferential Licensing Procedures for Military Trained Applicants and Their Spouses. In this new Section 506 of the Board Rules, they enumerate the definitions of military trained applicant and military spouse. A military trained applicant is a person who has completed a military program of training, been awarded a military occupational specialty, and has performed in that specialty at a level that is substantially equivalent to or exceeds the requirements for pharmacist licensure in this state. They also have to have engaged in the active practice of pharmacy and have not been disciplined in any jurisdiction for an act that would have constituted grounds for refusal, suspension, or revocation of a license to practice pharmacy in this state at the time the act was committed. A military spouse is defined as a person who can demonstrate marriage to a person in active military service duty, or with commitment to reserve duty. Also must hold a current and unrestricted license to practice pharmacy in another jurisdiction within the United States or any of its territories that has not been disciplined, and can demonstrate competency to practice pharmacy through various methods determined by the board: continuing education activity, letters of competency from previous managers, or personal interview. In Part B, we talk about marking applications for priority processing. And upon receipt of an application for pharmacist licensure by either one of these defined military trained applicants or military spouses, the board office shall mark the application for priority processing and preserve that status until the license is issued, or the board denies the license. In Part C, we discuss a special work permit, whereby the shall have access to it for 120 days after the date of issue, and the permit shall not be renewable until this is for them to be able to work until they get their permanent licensure. And finally, in Section D, we enumerate that it's not for those that are receiving dishonorable discharge. And furthermore, the provisions of this section shall not apply to a military spouse whose spouse has received or is in the process of receiving a dishonorable discharge from the military. The next update deals with penal pharmacy permits. And in Chapter 18, it was revised recently in November 2013 again, and they amended Section 1801 of this board rule. They clarified that this applies to those penal institutions owned and or operated by the Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections. So this part of the board rule does not apply to city or parish institutions. Only those that are operated by the Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections are eligible to apply for a penal pharmacy permit. The final board rule change that we're going to discuss for the year is dealing with out-of-state penal pharmacies. Chapter 23 of the board rules were revised recently, once again in November of 2013, where they amended Section 2303 entitled Out-of-State Pharmacy Requirements. They added in Section D, which states that any pharmacy dispensing and delivering prescriptions to offenders in custody of the Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections shall apply for and maintain a non-resident penal pharmacy permit, and further shall comply with the provisions of Chapter 18 of the board rules, with the exception of the necessity for acquiring a separate penal pharmacy permit, because they already have to have gotten a non-resident penal pharmacy permit. The last thing I'd like to discuss with you is collaborative drug therapy management, or CDTM practices. There's a regulatory proposal, which is 2013-H, which will hopefully clean up Chapter 5 and make it easier and clearer on the requirements for a collaborative practice agreement in the state. As we all know, the end of Chapter 5 is a daunting thing to read, and it all deals with CDTM. So we're hoping that this regulatory proposal allows more pharmacists to be able to know the requirements and make it easier on pharmacists to get CDTM and advance pharmacy practice. This concludes Part 1 of the lecture, dealing with the law update. And so now what I'd like you to do, each of these sections will have a forum post associated with the lecture. So for Part 1, the forum post is concerning, since you will be practicing pharmacist soon, what do you think about the pharmacy technician training being changed from that of a structured program as defined by the board to one that is nationally accredited and board approved? I'd like you to post your response to this question on Moodle. Thanks.